It started with a murder trial. A young man's life was on the line, and everyone in that courtroom thought they had it figured out. The lawyers were confident, the judge looked tired, and the janitor, he was just wiping down the floors, unnoticed in the corner. But what no one realized was that he saw something they missed, something important. While others were talking, he was listening. While they dismissed him, he was putting the pieces together. And when the case nearly collapsed from missing evidence, the quietest man in the room stood up and turned everything upside down. Stay with us, because this story proves that even the most overlooked person can change everything. And when the truth finally came out, the courtroom didn't just react, it exploded. The courtroom was buzzing with the usual hum of legal proceedings, but Elijah couldn't quite focus on the case. He moved through the room quietly, wearing his janitor uniform, with his bucket of cleaning supplies in tow. He'd been cleaning this courthouse for years, so the place felt like a second home. But today it felt different. His footsteps echoed a little too loudly on the cold marble floors, almost like they were calling attention to him. As he passed the bench, he could hear snippets of conversation, voices rising and falling as the attorneys and their clients huddled together, preparing for the next phase of the trial. His eyes were on the floor, his hands moving instinctively to scrub the spots from the corners of the room. But then a voice from one of the lawyers caught his attention, and he froze. "I can't believe this guy is even here," a deep voice sneered. "Doesn't even know what's going on. Just some janitor cleaning up after all of us." Elijah's heart sank. He knew they weren't talking about anyone else. It was him, just some janitor. They didn't know anything about him, of course. They didn't know he had once been a college student with a brilliant mind, one who could have been someone if life had just been different. No, they only saw the uniform, the one that symbolized years of hard work and humble service. He stood there frozen for a moment as the laughter from the lawyers echoed in his ears. They were mocking him, belittling him, but it wasn't just the mockery that stung. It was the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that he was less than them, that he didn't belong in the world of important people and legal battles. Elijah looked around. No one seemed to notice. No one cared. The attorneys were too busy with their own world, their own schemes and strategies. It was as if they couldn't even see him standing there, cleaning their mess, unnoticed, invisible. But Elijah wasn't invisible, not anymore. As he turned the corner, a quiet fire began to burn within him. He could take their mockery, he could take the jokes. But something inside him, something deep, shifted in that moment. It wasn't just the laughing, it was the realization that he'd spent too long letting people decide who he was, based on their assumptions, their judgments, their ignorance. It was time to show them something different. Perhaps he wasn't just a janitor after all. Elijah returned to his usual routine, pretending to go through the motions. He pushed his cart into the next hallway, his mind still replaying the cruel words he'd overheard. But as he moved past the rows of closed doors and high windows, a thought tugged at him. What if he wasn't meant to be here, just cleaning floors and scrubbing toilets? What if, just maybe, he was supposed to be more? The words of the lawyers burned in his mind, and as ridiculous as it sounded, a spark of anger mixed with something else, something deeper. He moved into the courtroom again, where he was tasked with cleaning the witness stand. The sound of his mop slapping against the floor was almost rhythmic, and for a second, he allowed himself to sink into the familiar act of cleaning. But as his hands worked, his mind wandered. He wasn't just any janitor. Elijah had spent years poring over textbooks and working on algorithms. He had developed an affinity for logic and patterns, skills that had once earned him a full scholarship in computer science before life had taken its unexpected turns. When he'd been forced to leave college, it was as though the world had closed its doors to him. His life had been reduced to this, scrubbing floors, emptying trash cans, making himself invisible to those who had once been his peers. But deep down, he knew he hadn't lost his edge. As his mop slid along the floor, Elijah's mind quickly began constructing a solution to a puzzle he'd overheard during the trial. It had started small, a few disconnected pieces of information, but now it began to make sense. The timeline of the crime, the missing evidence, the inconsistencies in the testimonies. It all clicked in place. The janitor's mind raced, his fingers moving faster on the handle of his mop, as he mentally pieced together the algorithm that could solve the mystery. Elijah paused, wiping his brow. Could he really do this? Could he expose the truth in front of everyone? For the first time in a long while, the thought of stepping forward didn't seem impossible. The idea of standing up, being noticed, not just as the janitor, but as someone who could change the course of this trial, didn't seem so crazy anymore. For the briefest moment, a smile tugged at his lips. Maybe it was time to show them all just how wrong they were about him. The day of the trial had arrived, and the courtroom was more crowded than Elijah had ever seen it. The tension in the air felt palpable, like the weight of 1,000 eyes all trained on one singular purpose. Today, the case that had been ongoing for weeks would finally reach its climax. Elijah had never cared much for the specifics of the trial. He'd heard bits and pieces in passing, enough to understand the gravity of the situation. A man's life hung in the balance, and as he cleaned, he overheard details of how the case had begun to fall apart. Elijah's mop slid quietly across the floor as he moved through the rows of empty seats. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavernous room, but he was just another presence, unnoticed by the attorneys, witnesses, or even the judge. Or so he thought. As the trial pressed on, the defense team fidgeted nervously, clearly troubled by something. Elijah caught snippets of their hurried whispers as he worked, something about missing evidence, a key piece that had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Elijah couldn't help but listen, his curiosity piqued. "Where is the video footage from the convenience store?" one of the defense lawyers muttered. "It was supposed to be filed last week." The other lawyer clicked his pen anxiously. "They've been stalling. The prosecution knows that without it, we have no case. Without that video, we don't stand a chance." Elijah's mind began to race. Video footage. That was the key. He was certain of it. He hadn't seen the evidence personally, but he remembered something from the night of the alleged crime. A fleeting moment during one of his late-night cleaning shifts when he'd stumbled across an envelope in the trash. It had been tucked inside a discarded file folder, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, though, it suddenly made sense. What if the missing evidence had been tampered with? What if this was all a setup? The idea struck him like a lightning bolt. Suddenly, the realization hit him. He was seeing the solution to a puzzle, a solution no one else could see because they were too wrapped up in the details to look at the bigger picture. The truth hidden in plain sight. And it wasn't just about the missing video. It was about the timeline. The whole case didn't add up. Elijah had the pieces that could crack the entire thing wide open. He glanced around, half expecting someone to notice his sudden shift in focus, but no one was looking. They never did. For a moment, the world outside the courtroom felt distant, like it didn't matter. It was just him now, the janitor, the observer. He could stay in his place, stay invisible, and nothing would change. But then, a thought flickered. What if he didn't have to stay in the background? What if he could step forward and change everything? Elijah stopped cleaning, holding his mop for a moment longer than usual. He turned toward the judge's bench. The courtroom was alive with chatter, but all he could hear was the question pounding in his head. Could he reveal the truth now? Could he make a stand? With a deep breath, Elijah stepped forward. He hadn't fully decided what to do next, but something inside him had shifted. Today wasn't just another day in the background. Today was different. The courtroom was thick with anticipation. Elijah stood in the back, his mind racing, his hands gripping the handle of his mop tighter than usual. His heart beat faster as the judge called for a brief recess. The lawyers were huddled in the corner, deep in conversation, their backs turned to the rest of the room. Elijah's thoughts swirled. He wasn't sure how it had come to this. He had never been the type of person to step into the spotlight. He had always been comfortable in the background, doing his job and staying unnoticed. But now something had changed. The missing evidence, the timeline that didn't add up, the file he had found in the trash. Elijah's mind worked over the details like a puzzle he couldn't resist solving. He could see it all clearly now, every piece falling into place. The timeline of the murder, the missing security footage, the alibis that didn't quite match. They were all lies, or at least half-truths. Elijah glanced at the defense lawyer's anxious expression, the way he kept looking at his watch, hoping for some miracle to save the case. He could feel the weight of the decision in his gut, a heavy pressure that felt like it would crush him if he didn't do something about it. The truth was there, right in front of him. He had the proof, the missing link that could change everything. But was he willing to expose himself? To put himself in the spotlight? To risk everything? A voice in his head whispered, "What's the worst that could happen?" Maybe they'd laugh at him again. Maybe they'd dismiss him as just another janitor with no place in this world of lawyers, judges, and experts. But what if? What if he was wrong? What if they listened? What if the truth mattered more than their opinions of him? His pulse quickened as he thought about the victim, about the family who was waiting for justice. They didn't deserve this charade. He didn't know the details of the murder, but he knew one thing: the wrong person was being blamed. Elijah's gaze flickered from the defense team to the judge's bench. He saw the judge, a stern man with a hard face, clearly growing impatient with the delays. No one else seemed to notice Elijah's presence in the back of the room, his mop abandoned now, standing like a silent witness to it all. He took a breath. It's now or never. With a resolve he didn't know he had, Elijah straightened his back and started walking toward the front of the courtroom. His footsteps were deliberate, echoing in the room, each one growing louder in his ears. No one seemed to notice him at first, but as he drew closer to the judge, heads turned, eyes wide with confusion. Elijah could feel his pulse in his throat. He had no idea what he was about to say, only that he couldn't stay silent any longer. This was his moment, the one he had been waiting for. The judge's voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir, what is it that you want?" The judge's tone was sharp, skeptical. Elijah stopped at the edge of the defense table. For the first time in a long while, he felt something powerful coursing through him. Not fear, but purpose. "I have evidence," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "And I think it'll prove who the real killer is." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Elijah approached the front, every step feeling like it took him further away from the life he'd known. It was almost surreal. He, a janitor, standing in the center of a high-stakes murder trial where the lives of two families were hanging in the balance. His fingers twitched as he reached the judge's bench, his mind still buzzing with the details of the case. "Sir," the judge said, his voice cool, "I'm going to have to ask you to explain yourself. What exactly are you doing here?" Elijah paused, the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The defense attorneys were watching him with confused expressions, unsure whether this was some kind of prank. The prosecutor, who had been so composed up until that point, looked almost irritated. But Elijah didn't falter. He'd come too far to back down now. "I'm Elijah Cross," he began, his voice carrying louder than he expected. "And I believe I have a timeline that proves the defendant is innocent." The courtroom erupted in low murmurs, the tension rising in the air as everyone turned their attention to him. He could feel the eyes of every person in the room, judges, jurors, lawyers, and even the defendant, scrutinizing him, waiting for the next words to leave his mouth. Elijah swallowed hard. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but in this moment, it felt right. "I've been watching this case unfold," Elijah continued, "and there's something about it that didn't sit right with me. The timeline doesn't add up, and there's a missing piece of evidence. The security footage from the convenience store near the crime scene." A murmur rippled through the room. The defense lawyer looked at the prosecutor, his eyes widening. The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up, clearly rattled. "That footage was supposed to be submitted last week," the prosecutor muttered under his breath. But Elijah didn't pause. He had their attention now, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I know where it is," Elijah said, his voice stronger this time. "And I also know that the person you've been accusing, they didn't do it." For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. The judge's eyes narrowed, as if trying to piece together why this man, this janitor, was claiming to know things that none of the seasoned professionals had figured out. "I have an algorithm," Elijah said, taking a deep breath. "It's a timeline I've put together based on everything I've seen. It tracks the movements of the accused, the victim, and the actual killer. And what I've found is," he paused, looking at the jury, "it's not the person you think it is." He slowly unrolled a piece of paper from his back pocket, the one he'd been holding onto for dear life, the one that contained everything he'd meticulously tracked over the past several days. He didn't hand it over yet. He knew it wasn't enough to just say it. He needed to show them. "You want the truth," Elijah said, locking eyes with the judge, then the jury. "Then I'm going to give it to you." The room was unnaturally quiet. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Elijah as he stood there, holding the timeline in his hands like a prize he wasn't sure he had earned yet. His heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic drum beat that seemed to echo through the silence. He could feel the weight of their stares, some skeptical, others curious, all demanding an explanation. The judge's voice broke through the stillness. "Mr. Cross," he began, his tone even but sharp, "you claim to have a timeline that clears the defendant. Please enlighten us. How exactly does this timeline prove his innocence?" Elijah nodded, his mind racing but his hands steady as he unrolled the paper and spread it out in front of him. The faint scratch of his fingers on the paper was the only sound as he carefully laid it on the witness stand. He could hear the soft click of the court reporter's machine, capturing every word. "I've been watching this case from the sidelines," Elijah started, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen the patterns, some of them so small that no one else would notice. The times when the security footage went missing, the inconsistencies in the defendant's alibi, they didn't add up. And I kept thinking, someone is lying." He pointed to a spot on the timeline where the movements of the defendant and the victim collided. "Right here," he said, his finger tracing the path on the paper. "The defendant was supposed to be at a different location at this time, but the records show otherwise. And this part," he pointed to another section, "the missing footage, it's not missing. It was never submitted. I tracked it, and it leads straight to this convenience store, where someone else, someone we haven't even looked at, was seen leaving the scene." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, but Elijah ignored him. He was too focused on the task at hand. "The key to this entire case," Elijah continued, "was the timeline. The killer wasn't the defendant. The killer was someone else who used the confusion and the missing evidence to their advantage." There was a collective gasp from the courtroom. The defense attorney's eyes widened, and he stood, eager to respond. "Your Honor, are we to believe that this man," he gestured toward Elijah, "has single-handedly solved this case with a homemade timeline? How can we trust this?" Elijah's gaze met the judge's. He had expected the skepticism, but he was ready. "I've spent days looking at the evidence no one else cared to examine. This isn't just a theory, it's the truth. All I ask is that you give it a chance. Don't let a guilty man go free just because it's convenient." The judge took a long pause, his eyes flicking between Elijah and the defense team. There was no denying the gravity of the situation. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Elijah had put everything on the line. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the moment stretched on. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "Mr. Cross," he said, his voice unwavering, "this court will review the timeline you've presented. You may step back." Elijah exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. He had done it. The first step toward justice had been taken. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The room was electric with tension. The judge had given his order, and now Elijah stood quietly off to the side, waiting for the courtroom to process what had just happened. The defense team was whispering among themselves, their voices a low murmur as they tried to digest the revelation. The prosecutor, however, had a more immediate reaction. His face had turned red with frustration, his jaw clenched so tight Elijah thought it might snap. "Mr. Cross," the prosecutor called, his voice cold and sharp, "you've presented a timeline. You've made a bold claim, but what you haven't explained is how we can trust this evidence. You're just a janitor, aren't you? What qualifications do you have to stand up here and tell us how a murder was committed?" The question hit like a punch. Elijah's throat went dry, but he didn't back down. He'd heard these kinds of questions before, the kind that questioned his place in the world, his worth, as if his job somehow diminished his intellect. But he had something to prove, not just to the court, but to himself. "I may not have a degree in criminal justice," Elijah replied, his voice steady, "but I've spent the last few days studying every detail of this case. I've seen things no one else has seen because I've had the time to pay attention." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. He wasn't convinced. "And you expect us to believe that a janitor, someone who's supposed to be cleaning the floors, somehow cracked the case that the detectives couldn't?" He scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" Elijah's pulse quickened, but he remained calm. He had anticipated this. Everyone in the courtroom expected him to be an outsider, someone who didn't belong. But Elijah had learned long ago that people underestimated him because of his job, his appearance. They didn't know who he really was. "I don't expect you to believe me," Elijah said, lifting his chin. "I expect you to look at the evidence. It's right here," he said, pointing to the timeline. "It's right in front of you." The defense attorney, who had been silent up until now, stood and addressed the court. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecutor is attempting to discredit Mr. Cross based on his occupation rather than his evidence." The judge nodded, his gaze stern. "Sustained. Mr. Prosecutor, stick to the evidence." The prosecutor's face darkened, but he took a step back, forced to reframe his approach. He cleared his throat before speaking again. "Mr. Cross," he said, trying to regain control, "you say the footage was missing, but how can you be so sure? What proof do you have that the footage was ever there to begin with?" Elijah paused, his mind racing. He had prepared for this. He had made sure that every step of his timeline was backed up with something tangible. "The convenience store manager," Elijah said, his voice firm. "I spoke with him. He said the footage was never lost. It was just never submitted to the court. They had it the whole time." The prosecutor's eyes flashed with realization, but he was quick to cover it up with a sneer. "And you expect us to believe the word of a store clerk over the trained professionals who've handled this case?" Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to believe anyone. I'm asking you to look at the truth, follow the evidence, and then decide for yourselves." There was a pause, and for a moment, it felt like the entire courtroom held its breath. The judge, who had been silently observing, gave a subtle nod, as if acknowledging Elijah's resolve. "Mr. Cross," the judge said, "you've made your point. The court will now review the additional information you've provided. You may step down." Elijah turned and walked away from the witness stand, his footsteps loud in the otherwise quiet room. It felt like the air was still thick with skepticism, but Elijah didn't care. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to the jury and the judge to decide. He had done everything he could. The hours dragged on. Elijah sat in the back of the courtroom, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his mind racing. The court was in recess, and the judge had ordered a review of the timeline Elijah had presented. It was strange, this limbo he found himself in. Too close to the end to back out now, but still waiting for the final decision. Outside the courtroom, Elijah could hear snippets of conversation. Lawyers, reporters, even bystanders who'd gathered to see the spectacle of a janitor changing the course of a trial. Whispers of doubt and disbelief floated through the air. Some people mocked him quietly. Others were intrigued, but it didn't matter. He had already done what he set out to do: expose the truth. What happened now was beyond his control. His thoughts drifted to his life outside the courtroom, to his small apartment, to the quiet evenings he spent reading, solving problems no one asked him to solve. Elijah had always been a thinker, always had a knack for patterns and puzzles, but no one ever cared until now. He shook his head, focusing again on the present. It was easy to get lost in memories, to let his mind wander back to the days when he was just another invisible man. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He was part of something bigger. The door to the courtroom opened and the judge entered, his somber expression setting the tone for what was to come. Elijah stood, straightening his back, his legs slightly shaky but steady enough to face whatever was next. The judge motioned for everyone to be seated. The room fell into a hushed silence, the weight of anticipation palpable in the air. Elijah's heart hammered in his chest. Was this it? Would the judge finally recognize his evidence? Would they finally see the truth? The court has reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Cross, the judge began, his voice cutting through the tension. We find that the timeline and additional information provided have raised serious questions about the defendant's involvement in the crime. Therefore, the court is requesting a full investigation into the matter. Elijah held his breath. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected them to go so far. A full investigation? It was a victory, yes, but not the one he had imagined. This wasn't the final decision. It was just the beginning of another long process. The prosecutor stood, clearly stunned. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, he argued, his voice trembling with frustration. We cannot entertain this kind of intervention. But the judge was unmoved. The court will proceed with the investigation. I will not let a potential miscarriage of justice stand. The defense attorney turned toward Elijah, his face tight with a forced smile. Well, Mr. Cross, it seems you've done what we could not. I'm sure your timeline will become a pivotal piece of evidence as the investigation unfolds. Elijah nodded, though his heart didn't lighten. It wasn't over. He had taken a step forward, yes, but the path ahead was still unclear. He had given them the pieces, but it was up to others to put them together. The feeling of relief that should have washed over him didn't come. Instead, there was only the weight of a long road still to travel. As he left the courtroom, Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had fought for the truth, and that was more than he had ever hoped for. The day of the investigation had arrived. Elijah stood in front of the courthouse, the air thick with anticipation. His body felt oddly stiff, as if the weight of everything that had transpired over the past few days had settled into his bones. The tension in the city was palpable. Everyone was waiting for the results of the investigation, which had been sparked by Elijah's timeline. He knew this was a crucial moment, a final opportunity for the truth to shine through. But there was one more thing hanging over his head. The prosecutor, the man who had belittled him, tried to discredit him, and still hadn't let go of the idea that a janitor couldn't possibly be the one to crack a case. Elijah had seen the prosecutor's angry glances and heard the whispered threats after court adjourned. He knew the man wasn't going to let this go easily. As Elijah made his way toward the courthouse steps, he spotted the prosecutor standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for him. His face was dark, his hands clenched at his sides. Elijah Cross, the prosecutor said, his voice low and menacing. I don't know how you did it, but I'll make sure this never happens again. You've embarrassed the system. You've embarrassed me. Elijah didn't flinch. He'd seen enough to know that intimidation was just another tactic, another way for people to try and regain control. He took a slow step forward, locking eyes with the prosecutor. You embarrassed yourself the moment you chose to overlook the truth, Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. I'm not the one who's been playing games with people's lives. The prosecutor sneered, but Elijah could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew the prosecutor was losing the battle. No amount of anger could change the fact that Elijah had presented undeniable evidence. Evidence that the jury and the judge were now taking seriously. You think you've won? The prosecutor spat. This is far from over. You may have made some noise, but the system doesn't change just because you show up with some numbers and a theory. Elijah took another step closer. The system didn't change because of my theory, he said. It changed because of the truth. And that's something you can't hide, no matter how hard you try. There was a long pause, the weight of Elijah's words hanging in the air. The prosecutor's face was tight with frustration, but deep down, Elijah knew that man had been beaten. He had underestimated Elijah from the start, and now the tide had turned. With a final, bitter glance, the prosecutor turned and walked away. Elijah didn't watch him leave. Instead, he turned back toward the courthouse, his steps steady and purposeful. The confrontation had been necessary. He had needed to make it clear that he wasn't just some janitor anymore. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that courtroom with nothing but a bucket and a broom. Elijah had proven that the system could be challenged, that the truth could prevail, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. And he was about to witness the final confirmation that justice, no matter how long it took, would find its way. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye trained on the judge's bench as the final moments of the trial unfolded. Elijah sat at the back, the quiet hum of whispers filling the room. His heart pounded in his chest, but he remained calm, hands folded tightly in his lap. The prosecutor had tried everything: denial, distraction, even desperate accusations. But none of it had worked. The evidence Elijah had presented was irrefutable. The truth was finally about to emerge. The judge looked down from his bench, his face unreadable. Elijah had seen this expression before. After the investigation had begun, after the prosecutor had made his last-ditch efforts to sabotage the case. But today, the judge seemed different. Perhaps it was because Elijah had finally made the system listen. Maybe it was because the facts were so clear, so undeniable, that even the most hardened cynics had no choice but to accept them. The prosecutor had made his final arguments, but his voice had lacked the conviction it once had. He had been cornered, and it was evident. The defense had no choice but to stand back and let the evidence speak for itself. And now Elijah was about to witness the culmination of everything he had fought for. The court has reviewed the evidence in its entirety, the judge began, his voice steady but heavy with significance. And based on the undeniable timeline presented by Mr. Cross, as well as the additional facts uncovered during the investigation, the jury has come to a unanimous decision. Elijah felt a sharp breath catch in his throat. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. We find the defendant, Carl Stevenson, guilty of murder in the first degree, the judge continued, and Elijah's world seemed to still for a brief second. The room erupted. Gasps filled the air, and the once certain prosecutor now stood frozen, his face pale as the words sank in. The jury's verdict was clear. The truth had prevailed. Elijah didn't stand up right away. He couldn't. His mind was still processing what had just happened. A janitor, a nobody. Yet here he was, sitting in the very seat of the courtroom, witnessing the results of his work, the work that had shattered assumptions, broken through the walls of the justice system, and delivered the truth. The prosecutor, still in shock, shot one final glance toward Elijah before walking out of the courtroom. But Elijah didn't feel satisfaction, not in the way others might have imagined. He didn't need to gloat or make some grand gesture. He had done what was right. The truth had been given its due. Justice had been served. As the judge wrapped up the proceedings, Elijah stood slowly, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He turned and walked out of the courtroom with quiet dignity, knowing that his role was done. He had won. Not for himself, but for the system he had challenged, and for the innocent lives the truth had saved. Elijah's steps were steady as he left the courthouse, the weight of the past few days finally lifting. He had done what no one had expected him to do. The world had seen him, not as a janitor, but as a force of change. And in the end, that was all that mattered.